Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and today we're going to be talking about the Milwaukee Bucks. The Bucks came into this season as one of the top picks to win the NBA Finals, and it made sense why. They were led by Giannis Antetokounmpo, widely considered the best player in the world, Chris Middleton, an amazing second option, Jrue Holiday, a high-level defensive guard, who has really been one of the most underrated players in the league for quite some time at this point, and Brook Lopez, who is coming off of a back surgery, but seemed poised for a great bounce-back season. You add in a bunch of really solid supporting cast pieces, and also the fact that they have championship experience winning a finals with this exact core a few seasons ago, it made sense why a lot of people picked the Bucks to ultimately raise the Larry O'Brien at the end of this season. And in the regular season, they met and even surpassed some of those expectations. They were phenomenal. Giannis finished third in MVP voting. Brook Lopez was second in Defensive Player of the Year voting while also shooting a career high from three. Chris Middleton didn't play a lot of the season, which is even more a testament to why the Bucks' great record was so impressive. And he didn't look like himself for a lot of the year, but by the end, he was looking like himself. Jrue Holiday made his first All-Star appearance in about a decade. Things were looking up for the Milwaukee Bucks. They entered the playoffs as the number one overall seed, and it seemed like they were poised to at least make a deep run in the Eastern Conference, if not make their second NBA Finals in 3 years, and ultimately maybe even win the whole thing. It wasn't going to be easy though, because in the second round, they'd have to face either the New York Knicks or the Cleveland Cavaliers, both really solid squads. In the Eastern Conference Finals, they were going to have to face either Boston or Philly, who are both really great teams on their own. And then, of course, they've got to face the winner of the Western Conference in the NBA Finals. So it wasn't going to be easy, but it seemed very possible that the Bucks could end up pulling it off. And it all began in the first round against the Miami Heat. And Miami has a lot of experience. They went to the finals back in 2020. They made the Eastern Conference Finals a couple of times last year. They were a Jimmy Butler 3 away from making the NBA Finals themselves. And sure, they hadn't been great all season, but they were definitely tougher than your usual 8-seeded opponent. However, I picked the Bucks to go ahead and sweep them. I thought they were the far better team. Miami's offense was pretty inconsistent, and while Jimmy Butler is great and consistently levels up in the playoffs, this Heat team was just nowhere near the level of the Bucks, or at least that's what I thought. But then the Bucks lost game one with Giannis getting hurt in the process. He fell on his back, and while the injury didn't seem incredibly severe, it seemed like it was possible it could keep him out of a couple of games. Now, this was no big deal because it's still the Milwaukee Bucks, and in game two, even without Giannis, they destroyed the Heat on their home court. It was an absolute blowout, and it seemed like we could be in for more of those as the series went on, even if Giannis didn't play. But then in game three, where Giannis, like I said, did not participate, the Heat returned the blowout. They destroyed the Bucks to take a 2-1 series lead, with Game 4 coming in Miami, and still Giannis' status was up in the air. Now, it still was not panic time or anything like that, because eventually Giannis was announced to be returning for Game 4, so the Bucks would probably destroy the Heat in Game 4, tie the series up. They would have 2 of the last 3 games at home to win, and even if the series went to 6 or 7 games, the Bucks would probably be fine in the end. Except for the fact that then in Game 4, Jimmy Butler dropped 56 points in one of the greatest playoff performances of all time to take a 3-1 series lead over the number 1 overall seeded Milwaukee Bucks. Now, things were getting dicey, but even still, they still had 2 of the remaining 3 games if they could force them at home. Giannis was back. They seemed fully healthy. And sure, the Heat had them on the ropes, but it was still the Milwaukee Bucks. There was no way they were going to lose in the first round. But then the impossible happened, because the Miami Heat in Game 5 in overtime defeated the Milwaukee Bucks on the Bucks' home court, eliminating the number 1 overall seed as an 8 seed, a team that needed 2 play-in games to even make the playoffs. They did it. The Heat knocked them off. Jimmy Butler was amazing again. He had this crazy shot to send the game to overtime. A lot of guys on the Heat stepped up as well. Their 3-point shooting was lights out. And Milwaukee fell. They lost in 5 games as the number 1 overall seed, becoming just the 6th number 1 seed ever to lose to an 8 seed. It was an embarrassment. It was disappointing. It was a failure of a season for the Milwaukee Bucks, a team that had championship aspirations and fell just about as short as you could possibly fall. Now, obviously, Giannis' injury played some role in this upset, but it's definitely not an excuse. I mean, you were down 2-1 with Giannis coming back. You were going to have multiple games on your home court still. They had a wide open opportunity to make this thing happen. All they had to do was not let Jimmy Butler drop 56 on their heads, not let him send the game to overtime in Game 5. they had chances. I mean, teams have come back from 3-1 deficits before. They were the number 1 overall seed. They got Giannis back down 2-1 and still could not execute against a Heat team that themselves were missing Tyler Hero ever since game 1 where he broke his hand, and Victor Oladipo, who I think injured his patella, I believe it was, during one of the games as well. So they themselves were beat up while being the far lower seed, and you were a Bucks team that the entire season dealt with injuries, yet were able to overcome them. But in this biggest moment, they couldn't do so. Even when Giannis came back, they shrank under the lights. It was a complete disaster, and once again, it was a failure. Now, you probably know most of, if not all of this story already, but I think it's important to set up the groundwork for why this Bucks team was so disappointing this season. And while a lot of people are talking about that, I'm sure you've heard about it a million times, I don't think enough people are talking about what the Bucks' future looks like beyond this season, because you would think, they bring in a new head coach, they just fired Mike Budenholzer, they've still got Giannis, they've got Chris Middleton, Jrue Holiday, Brook Lopez, a decent supporting cast, although one that could use some upgrades, but they'll probably be a championship contender next season, right again. They'll be one of the top seeds in the Eastern Conference, and they'll probably bounce back from this. And yeah, I do think that's the most likely outcome, but at the same time, as we look forward to next season and even the couple of seasons beyond that, the Bucks' future is very uncertain. Like, this Bucks team, as we know it, could be completely gone within the next 3 years, which seems impossible, but I don't think it's that unlikely. Milwaukee has quickly gone from a team that looked like they could win multiple championships with this Giannis, Chris, Jrue, Brook Lopez core, to now it being a question of if this will even be what the team looks like in a few seasons, because the Bucks, things don't look good for them. Now, one thing is for certain for the Bucks for the next few years, and it's that Giannis Antetokounmpo will be on the roster. And as long as you have him with some solid supporting pieces, you're probably going to be one of the top teams in the NBA and competing for a title. That's ultimately what I do believe they will be doing next season, is battling for a championship. But there's a real chance that even if they are once again title contenders, they might not look anything similar to the way they did this season. And this is mainly because 2 of the Bucks' top 4 players, Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez, are free agents going into this offseason, which I think not many people are realizing. Chris Middleton has a player option, which I expect him to decline, and Brook Lopez is a straight up unrestricted free agent after one of the best seasons of his entire career at the age of 35. These are 2 huge contributors for the Bucks. Everything they did this season, everything they did in their championship run, it was really critical having those 2 guys involved, and if they could lose one or both of them this offseason, things suddenly look really, really bleak. Let's begin with Chris Middleton, who didn't have his best season. Like I said earlier, he dealt with a lot of injuries throughout the year, and when he did play, he didn't quite look like himself. He averaged just 15 points per game on the worst efficiency of his career, but he also did play the lowest number of minutes per game. He came off the bench. He was consistently out of rhythm because he was in and out of the lineup, so ultimately, I don't think that's a reflection of the player that he is, and what I do think is more of a reflection of who he is how he played in the playoffs, because although they lost that series, he was really good against the Miami Heat. He averaged 23.8 points per game on really solid efficiency to go with 6.4 boards and 6.2 assists in the series loss. So I think it's pretty clear that Chris Middleton is still really good and capable of playing at an all-star level. He's also very vital to this team in particular. I mean, he was their second option when they won the title a few years ago, and last year without him, they, like I said, pushed the Celtics to 7 games. Who knows how far the Bucks go if they have a healthy Chris Middleton? So he's very important to this team, so it seems likely that he'll opt out of his player option and sign a long-term deal with the Bucks, even though he's going on his year 32 season and has become somewhat injury prone as of late. However, there's a real possibility that maybe that big payday that he's looking for does not end up coming from the Milwaukee Bucks. There's rumors that maybe Chris Middleton could look to walk if a team offers him a lot more money than, say, maybe the Bucks do. Obviously, this would be a disaster if Chris leaves, because while they've got a good team outside of him, Giannis, Brook, Jrue, others, you need that consistent second scoring option on any championship team, and Jrue Holiday is not consistent whatsoever on the offensive end. Brook Lopez is good, but he's not an elite offensive option, at least not a second level one on a championship team. Giannis is incredible, but he can't carry the load himself, so the Bucks have to try and retain Chris Middleton at all costs if they want to compete for a championship next season, or at least try and get back another star in a sign and trade if Chris does decide to leave. But I don't think there's any team out there that's going to be looking for a scenario scenario like that. I think if Chris leaves, it's for a team with a lot of cap space that is looking for a high-level asset to add to try and make their roster better. I don't think they'd be looking for a swapping of stars. So they've probably got to bring back Chris. But there's also a concern with if you do bring back Chris, he's probably going to be asking for a 3-4 year max going forward, which is understandable. I mean, he was an all-star the past couple of seasons, showed he can be a second option on a championship team. He should ask for a max going 3 or 4 years, get a payday before he's 35, 36 years old, and probably won't get another one again. However, for the Bucks, that's a dicey situation because you're likely going to be paying Chris Middleton north of $40 million for the next 3 to 4 seasons. And like I said, he's still good now, but who knows how good Chris Middleton is going to be when he's 35, 36 years old, and if he regresses even a little bit, if the injuries linger, if he just stops being an all-star level player, and you're giving him $30, $40 million, you are significantly handicapping your roster in terms of its performance, and also your financial flexibility, which the Bucks already don't have a lot of. If you tie yourself to Chris Middleton and he's not that good at 35 years old and making like $45 million, that's suddenly a horrific contract that you're not going to be able to get rid of, and you're not going to be able to add more talent around Giannis and whoever else is on the roster. It's a similar story for Brook Lopez, who is also a free agent coming up and will be turning 36 this next season. Now, Brook has been amazing for the Bucks in his time in a Milwaukee uniform and probably just had his best season with them. Like I mentioned, he finished second in Defensive Player of the Year voting while also shooting a career-high 37.4% from deep. He was incredibly valuable, especially stepping up in the absence of some of the Bucks' other guys who missed time with injury. He was also incredibly integral to them winning the title in 2021. He's a big piece of what this team does, especially defensively, and it's really hard to find high-level defensive centers that can also shoot the lights out of the ball in the modern NBA. I mean, that is an incredibly coveted archetype of player, and they have one right here in Brook Lopez, so it makes a ton of sense to retain him and try and keep him going forward. But because he is such a valuable type of player, I'm sure there are going to be a number of teams that have cap space lining up to try and steal Brook Lopez away from Milwaukee. And if one of those teams offers him a ton of money while the Bucks aren't willing to quite pay up, maybe Brook Lopez walks. And if he does, that's a huge hit to the Bucks defense. They're going to be lacking that high-level guy that plays well on both sides of the ball that they're missing. And sure, they have Bobby Portis, who's great, but he doesn't provide the same type of stuff that Brook Lopez does. They're very different players. They really need a guy like Brook Lopez in this system. Now, maybe things change with the new head coach, but Brook is really valuable, and so letting him walk doesn't seem like a phenomenal option. But at the same time, re-signing him to a big long-term deal also is not super enticing. There's a realistic world where Brook Lopez asks for $20+ million a year as a 35 going on 36-year-old. Now, if he continues to play at this level for those years, that's a perfectly fine contract. That's maybe even a steal. But he's going to be 38, 39 years old at the end of that contract. Do you really think he's still going to be a Defensive Player of the Year level guy that's knocking down threes at this type of clip, especially someone who had a back surgery about a year ago at 38, 39 years old? I don't anticipate him being this good. So you could potentially financially handicap yourself. While maybe you're good next season and the year following, you could set yourself up for failure the years after. And if you combine that with maybe a potentially bad Chris Middleton contract, if you also sign him and he regresses, all of a sudden you're completely stuck with this core that you have, and it doesn't seem like a phenomenal one. Overall, it seems like the best solution for the Bucks is to try and keep these guys in town. I mean, you won a title with them, so you might as well try it again, even if this season was disappointing. But there's a real concern about the potential financial limitations that puts on them, the fact that those guys are getting older and older, and the core as a whole is aging themselves. And there's even the fact that they could just leave. Even if the Bucks try, one or both of those guys could dip out, and suddenly it's just Giannis and Drew chilling as the lone stars in Milwaukee. And there's even some concerns about Drew Holiday himself. Not only is Drew going to be 33 heading into this next season, but he also said, I believe recently on a podcast, that he's looking to potentially retire after his contract is up in the 2025 offseason. This means that the Bucks only have a few years left of Drew Holiday on the roster, and with how integral he was to them winning the title a few years ago, that could mean that their championship window only exists for a couple more seasons, at least with this core. Plus, even if Drew does end up going against that current retirement plan when 2025 rolls around, he's going to be a free agent, making the third star you have to try and retain in the next few off seasons, and maybe he walks, and even if you do re-sign him once again like Chris Middleton and like Brook Lopez, he's getting older. At that point, he'll be what, like 35 years old? Are you going to sign him to a long-term contract when you already might have an older Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez already on your salary books? Then there's Giannis, who, like I said earlier, is guaranteed to be on the roster for the next few years, but his contract is also coming to an end pretty quickly. He has a player option in that 2025 offseason that we just talked about with Jrue Holiday. And if the Bucks lose Chris, Brook, both of them, Jrue Holiday talks about retiring, the situation doesn't look good for Giannis. Or even if they bring back Chris, they bring back Brook, but they start to regress and the Bucks suddenly don't feel like long-term championship contenders, what if Giannis walks in that 2025 offseason? I think there's a legitimate chance that he does so. I mean, Giannis seems like he could potentially be a lifer guy, and ultimately, that's what I personally would like to see from Giannis. I'd love to see if he stayed for the entirety of his career, because that's something that's pretty rare, and he feels like a guy that just makes sense as a Bucks lifer. But there's no guarantees in the modern NBA. I mean, he talked about in a press conference one time that maybe he would want to play in Chicago at some point. Maybe he goes to a bigger market like in New York or in Los Angeles or something, where he goes plays for the Golden State Warriors. I don't know. But there are options out there for Giannis. And I'm sure that free agency, when he's 31 years old, teams are going to be absolutely lining up. Teams are going to be clearing cap space. They're going to be doing whatever they can. And if the Bucks have been disappointing for a couple of seasons, their core is aging, or they lost some of their stars, I think there's a real legitimate shot that Giannis leaves this team, which is obviously the nightmare scenario for the Bucks. They've got just 2 seasons to try and convince Giannis that, hey, Milwaukee's the spot where you can continue to compete for titles. But amongst all of this, there are a million question marks. Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez, both free agents and getting older. Jrue Holiday might retire. He's also getting up there in age. Their entire core is aging. They were the oldest team in the NBA this season. They just fired their head coach in Mike Budenholzer, which maybe ends up being a good thing. But that's just another question mark to add onto the pile. And to make things even worse, they also feel like they need to upgrade some of their role players, yet don't own any of their first round picks until 2027 due to the Jrue Holiday trade. So they really lack any significant assets going forward to make big time upgrades to this roster. I mean, they just gave up 5 second-round picks for Jay Crowder, who didn't even really play in the playoffs and is a free agent who's probably going to walk this offseason, because once again, they didn't play him in the playoffs. Everything is a question mark for the Bucks at this point, and it's crazy how they went from winning the title in 2021, seemingly having a chance at repeating in 2022 before injuries derailed their season, this year being one of the favorites to win it all, entering the playoffs as the prohibitive favorite to win the NBA Finals before ending up losing in the first round, and now everything seems kind of bleak for this team going forward. Now, if you ask me, the most likely scenario is that they're able to retain their stars, they run this thing back with a new head coach, maybe a Nick Nurse or a Charles Lee, for example, and they're probably still one of the best teams in the league next season, after hopefully making some upgrades to the supporting cast around their stars. And maybe they end up winning the championship next season. Giannis says, okay, I want to stay long-term. Chris Middleton, Brook Lopez, Jrue Holiday, none of them show signs of regression, and the Bucks still feel like a really high-level team for years to come. But there's also a real chance that this offseason things begin to crumble, even if they keep their stars and bring in a solid head coach and are competitive next season. The seeds have been planted for maybe a Jrue Holiday retirement. Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez may be financially handicapping the Bucks going forward. If there's any disappointment similar to this in upcoming seasons, maybe suddenly Giannis goes, hey, this might not be the spot for me to win championships and secure my legacy. There's a lot of uncertainty in the Bucks' future, even if next season it seems pretty likely that they're once again trying to compete for a championship. And amongst all of the disappointment with their first round exit, I feel like this is what's really getting lost is, hey, nothing is certain for the Bucks in this moment. After a couple years ago, it seemed like they could potentially have a small dynasty on their hands, winning a few rings in this Giannis era. Now, I have no idea what's going to happen. Maybe all this doom and gloom is for nothing, and ultimately everything is fine. But in my eyes, the Bucks have a lot to be worried about beyond this first round exit, which in of itself is a complete failure. Once again, I want to reiterate, I like this Bucks team and I don't want to see them fail, but I think it's important that we talk about just how weird of a position that they're in, and ultimately how this might be the beginning of the end for the Bucks as we currently know them. With all that being said, I appreciate y'all watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It helps the channel out a ton. And also comment down below letting me know what you think the Bucks future looks like and what you would do if you were the Bucks in this offseason. I want to make more of these videos where I talk about teams that have big off seasons coming up, teams that got eliminated from the playoffs. So if you have any recommendations for teams you want to see me talk about, let me know in the comment section below. I think it's a great way to break up the consistent game recaps that I do around the time of the playoffs. But yeah, again, I appreciate y'all watching. I'll see y'all later. Real one, say it back.